was standing in the yard, and something had happened. I don't know, something unpleasant in the vicinity. Some animal killed or something. Something had happened. And I wasn't saying anything, and I didn't ask Robin to say anything, and he looked me straight in the eye and he said, you know, he said, if I could feel, I personally could feel the weight of all the suffering in this world, I would fall right down through the core. I would just drop out completely. The weight of it would be more than I could bear. Now, if that isn't a man with the sympathy with life, I have never told this before. I signed that paper you gave me. You could use it. I have to be careful what I say. Mm-hmm. But if a word is perhaps misplaced, I know that Lee Jeffers wouldn't object that I said, he said if I could feel it at one time, he meant all at once, you know, like some terrible weight that maybe, suppose somebody threw you in the ocean and put a weight around you and you knew you couldn't come up. Wouldn't that be more or less the same kind of thing? That is what he said, and he meant it. Yeah. I consider him, I would like to say that I consider him, we knew Robert Frost well. My mother studied with him, and many other poets. I consider Jeffers the most extraordinary American poet, perhaps of our generation and the last generation. And I still don't think that people realize, they're so afraid, you know. They don't understand what a tremendous prophet this fellow was. I mean, and he saw years and years ago, you remember that line? America settling in the mold of its vulgarity. Look around you.
Well, we were wondering if you could just talk a little about the photos in the caves at Point Lobos.
Yes, well, that had a practical inception. Mm-hmm. The mother suddenly got terribly ill toward the end with the strokes, and I couldn't be away during the day too much or do a lot of heavy painting or be involved in things that were, you know. Mm-hmm. I had my studio there. That's where I asked Merle to do this shepherdess thing. But anyway, I had been to India with Christian Purdy, and I had a camera. I had enough money. No, I couldn't possibly do this today. I don't know what this is costing you, but I know that I could no more have bought the slides and the camera and had them developed today that I was able to do then. It would be quite beyond my financial possibilities. It was just that in those days you could buy good film for a certain amount. I bought an Alpha camera. Have you ever heard of an Alpha? It's a Swiss camera. I had an Alpha and I had good little film, color film, you know. So I had two big friends in life. One was Edward, the other was Ansel. So I knew something about photography. But so when Mother got so sick, I came to a halt with the big painting, and I thought, gee, why, maybe I could do some photography, and it wouldn't take up much time, and I could do it in off hours when the nurse was on duty and so on. So those were the days when I had to run at Point Lobos. We were considered the guardians of the Southern Gate. Imagine. The warden, I mean, nobody entered Gibson Beach except through our property, they thought. So I thought, I had seen a cave, a certain cave, with these fantastic colors in it. And nobody had paid any attention. It's very hard to get into that cave, and only at very low tide. And most of these low tides occurred in the dawn hours. that I could use. So I appealed to the head warden, who was already predisposed kindly toward the Kellogg's, and I said, if I were to go into the park before dawn or by dawn or right after dawn and do this photography, what would you say? And he said I'd say it'd be perfectly all right. So I started going in there watching for the tides, and I had the Alpa, and I went in there and it was a revelation. And you see, my father being a scientist, I had a little angle on the animals in there, not just the colors. So I went in there, and that enabled me to give the rest of my time to my mother. So I did this over a period of a couple of years, and I think I told you I finally gave a showing, you know, at home, and the Ansel came, and all these people came, and I had some very good food. And well, they're still in existence, and they're destined to this museum. I want to give a showing, I guess, down here at the Maritime Place, and maybe eventually a publication of some sort. I don't care as long as the slides are preserved. I showed them then here and there, San Francisco and here and around, but and they made some imprint because I tied up the science in it. But this place, you can't get in there anymore. It's all eroded. The sea came and knocked out the banks, and you can't get down there. And even if you could, I couldn't. My physical strength, you see, I'm not able to do these things anymore. And so I used to go in there, and I lost some things in the water. And when the tide came in, it filled up the whole cave, and you had to get out awfully quickly. So that's sad, but
there's a painting at the Maritime Museum of the, was it the Paddington Landing? I don't know the name of it.
That's my painting. Have they got it up? Finally?
I think so.
No kidding.
We haven't gone down there to see it, but they.
Well, that's mine.
Well, where is that located? I don't know.
That's not the cave.
I know, but.
It's a strange painting. Well, I'm glad they've shown. I knew they had it. They've had it for a long time. It was on display when the museum was down in the Allen Knight room below the Monterey Museum.
Right.
But I didn't think they had it up because they have so many ships.
Yes.
But yes, you mean they've got Partington Landing up there, a big oil painting?
That's what they said when I called, because we want to go down there and photograph it. And
yeah, well, that's it, all right. Well, I worked down in Partington for many years, and I lived in Big Sur for 6 months in a cabin there with my cat. And I studied with a person from the Chicago Art Institute who had come out this way, and it was he that persuaded me to, you know, the landing, which is gone now. I mean, all the winch, everything. So this is historical because it's mostly gone. But anyway, it was all of just old brown wood, the hoist and everything, and that's where the schooners came in to pick up the tan bark and the lime and deposit the food for the people before the road went through. You know, that's some landing. The Trotter boys, I think they had a hand in it. Anyway, it just fascinated me. So finally I decided to paint the thing. And of course I put a steamer out there, you know, just to show that there were ships somewhere. But anyway, I colored the wood red and blue and green and whatnot because of the influence of this man from Chicago. And it worked very well, but the sea was pure Dougherty. Anyway, I'm glad they have it up because I didn't think they'd have room. I thought maybe in the sort of room where people relax and talk or something they might have room. But you could ask to see it. They own it. They've got it. Whether it's in storage or there, I don't know. But it's a big painting, and that's the trouble. It takes space. And they have enormous exhibits of every kind of nautical artifacts known to man, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah, It's a wonderful
I
museum.
know Betty was saying that your painting is just a wonderful historical piece because there's
She
nothing.
was the first to show it in the museum in Carmel when she had a museum there.
Mhm.
Betty.
Yeah.
She showed it. Okay, well that's that. But anyway, that was the old coast. It is gone. I mean the landing.
Mhm.
But it meant a lot to me, and I used to crawl around to the outer part of it, on the outer rocks, and pretend I was going into outer space or something, you know. I mean, it's that kind of place.
Oh, wonderful. Wonderful quote from Andre Breton.
Oh, you remembered that?
Yes, that was beautiful.
I will quote it with great pleasure. I hope one has to put oneself in a state of grace with chance.
So
You
what
see?
transpired between the shepherdess and Vasquez?
Well, good advice mostly from Vasquez. Well, what transpired between them? Well, you know, when you get somebody like Jeffers who writes that kind of story, these people are rather what you might call symbolic. They represent something in the human mind.
Mm-hmm.
And the base of the story, of course, is actual fact. The cowboy and the girl and the awful thing that brought her such sadness in the first place. I mean, the fact that she was with child, you see, and she had these sheep, but she had nowhere to go and all of that. But Vasquez, who represents, well, you know what Jeffers felt about the Indians and the people of the earth and the universal eye. I even drew the eye. It was his heart and spirit that was moved by this girl and her suffering. And so he kept an eye on her, you might say. And I used to know this story by heart, but I'm stumbling along here.
Maybe you could read one of your favorite passages, or
You see, here are some Indians right here that I did. Now this is etching, has nothing to do with dry point, but it is wove paper. Not that Norwegian stuff, but French. But you see, there's absolutely no grain in it whatsoever. Now you want to see this and find out why it's my favorite. This is it. The fight between the heron and the hawk.
oh yeah.
Can you see it?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's a fight between two birds. Well, when I got to Benares, if you know where that is on the Ganges River, there is a famous museum there. And you know that the ancient Mughal miniatures, many of them concentrated on birds and animals. And they were not etchings, they were very fine paintings, small. And so, how I got into the office of the head of this place, I don't know. But then you don't know me. But I did. And the head of the museum looked the book over in Benares. He spoke perfect English, they all do. And he saw this. Ah, he said. And then he spoke to somebody in the office there who was a painter himself, miniature. And he said, go and get such and such a miniature and bring it here. And so they went off and they got a miniature of a bird fight in color. And I was so proud. And then he said, in honor of this occasion, I will make you a gift. And he gave me a brush with the tiniest hairs, squirrel, I don't know what they were. And he said, "This is the brush with which these miniatures are made." So I thought, that must be my best etching. Is that?
Jane, could we get you to read a little bit of the passage that that etching illustrates? Could you do that for us, please?
Aye.
Just a little bit.
You see, here's Vasquez. Not the birds, huh? You asked me what did Vasquez.
Yeah, you could read a little of that too. That'd be wonderful.
Claire Walker, that's the shepherdess, turned, striving with the gesture of a terrified child to be quiet. Her clenched fist pressed on her mouth, her teeth against the knuckles, and her blonde hair wild on the wind. Oh, what can save him? Can save him? Oh, how he cried at each fall. This is the fight, the hawk and the heron. She's watching the birds, you see. Oh, what can save him? Can save him? Oh, how he cried at each fall. She crouched in the wind at the edge of the road, trembling. The ewe, called Tiny, crossed over and touched her. The others turned anxious looks from sniffing the autumn-pinched leaves of the groundling blackberries. When she was quieted, Vasquez said, "You love all creatures alike."
Beautiful. Thank you very much, Jean. Thank you. That's great.
And so, who could say that Jeffers is inhuman in his feelings? I mean, how could you think of more intense feeling toward life? Huh? Yeah. Let's see here. It's just one that, maybe. Well, as I said, it took a long time. Oh, see here. This is a dull etching, but that was the idea, the universal eye. The etchings aren't all that great. 2 or 3 of them are kind of interesting. And the old bridge is gone now. And I was such a realist, I had to go down there and sit under the bridge at night with a flashlight to make the etching, you know. I had no imagination. It was rough.
How many etchings in this book?
9.
9.
And the prototype, the thing that, you see the size of this? I was allowed to select the size and the format. Think of that. And I took it from a British poet who had illustrated the eclogues of Virgil. Samuel Palmer was his name. And he had illustrated the eclogues of Virgil with some beautiful etchings. And I was lucky enough to have had a copy of this. And I noticed how he alternated the dark etchings and the clear line etchings. And I took off from that. And also it was exactly that shape. I sent to France for the paper.
That's wonderful. Thought maybe you could go right into Bruno.
Oh, good. Would you like to start with Bruno?
Yeah.
Would please me very much.
Good.
You let me know when.
Okay. All right. You can begin.
How I met him, perhaps.
Yes.
Thank goodness. Well, he was the Minister of Art in Germany in the Weimar Republic, and also before Hitler. In other words, he was Minister of Art, not just painting or etching or sculpture or theater or whatever, but the whole business. And well, it's amusing. He had a box in the opera, of course, Berlin, and when Bruno Adriani walked into that box, the entire audience rose in respect. And many of the great artists of Germany, that period of Germany, pre-Hitler Germany, owed Dr. Adriani the patronage that enabled them to become successful. In fact, right over here in Robinson Jeffers Garden, there's a beautiful bronze eagle by Philip Harth, due to Bruno's having brought it over here. Well, to make a long story short, he saw the Hitler thing coming, and he had married an American woman, oddly enough, from the South, from our South, Sadie. And they were over there, and they saw this coming, and he tried to warn his relatives to get out quickly, and they wouldn't. They were stupid. But Bruno had a very important collection, especially of etchings, all the way from the Rembrandts and Dürers up to the most modern, and other things, paintings of great importance and sculptures. So first they went to Switzerland, and for some reason they came to Los Angeles. I don't know how or why. And then they arrived in Carmel, where they were immediately ostracized, I'm sorry to say, but not surprisingly, knowing some other things about the town. And so they didn't know anybody much, and they kept the door locked because they had a valuable collection, and they lived down there on the point, not far from the Robinson Jeffers. Anyway, one day I was going down Ocean Avenue, and I bumped into somebody by mistake. I didn't mean to. It was Dr. Adriani, so polite. And he said, "Oh, so sorry." Oh, I said, "So am I." And I introduced it. He said, "Well, I am Dr. Bruno Adriani." Well, I said, "I'm Jean Kellogg," and so on. And he said, "Well, what, I don't know. How did I say I wanted to be an artist or something?" And I don't know. It was one of those things. Oh, he said, "It would be so nice if you would come and call on us." Can you imagine? So one day I went down, and the door was locked, and I knocked on the door, and pretty soon he came to the door, and it opened, and he took me into his study, and that began 20 years of education. Everything I learned about etching, I learned from him, with the exception of 2 weeks in New York in the Hayter studio with some technical stuff, you know. But the techniques I learned by myself because I wrote the men that made the inks and all of that. But Bruno taught me the whole history of the art, the stylistic development of it, the whole business. Of course, he was just as good at sculpture and other things. But this extraordinary stroke of, you know, what could you say, kind of a fate almost. Without him, I'd have never made it, that's for sure, as an etcher. So he would listen, you see. He'd say, "Now bring me something." And so I would bring him something. And he'd look at it, and in some obscure way, he would see what you were driving at. It wasn't there, but he knew. So he figured out she likes the line of movement. So then he went to his extraordinary collection, and he picked out every single thing that bore on the subject of importance by great etchers. He said, "Now see, 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 see." So then I went home and bought nitric acid through the mail and had big trouble in the garage and all of that. But I began to see. And finally, when I did The Loving Shepherdess, which is the other thing you wanted to ask me about, Bruno came to watch me print. Can you believe it? And he would stand by the etching table, you know. He never printed anything in his whole life, obviously. He was what you call a critic. That's rather a formal term, but... And he'd say, he'd say, "A little darker here, a little lighter there." Very quiet voice. "That's good. That's enough." And so, of course, I knew his wife well, and a touching thing to wind up a long story would be that when my mother became very ill at the end of her life, we were living alone in the Highlands, and she'd had strokes and couldn't talk to friends, you know. But the Adrianis, they came, they knew that the inside mother could hear, and they would bring food and things. Then they'd sit by the bedside, and they'd never ask her to say anything. They would just tell her everything that had gone on at Carmel for the last week or whatever. And so then in the end, Sadie passed away. You know what? And Bruno was lonesome. He had a housekeeper that helped. But he had, listen, you know, Carmel is my town, but I have to tell you that it's not all good, even today. And Bruno had this incredible library, which he also brought along with the works of art. And he asked our librarian to come down there and have tea and look it over. The idea was to give it to the Carmel librarian. She never bothered to go. Now, names will not be named. And so he gave it to Stanford that didn't need it. But anyway, well, that's a little sideline on this. However, and Carmel was never totally, would you say, happy with the Adrianis. There was this thing that they had come out of that Holocaust, you know, that awful thing. He was a Bavarian. His name, it sounds Italian, doesn't it? Adriani.
Yes.
It was a kind of a Bavarian. But I could go on and on. I
Well,
have many of his books that were translated into many languages. And he patronized a young woman in Southern California. I have one of her sculptures over here, the black hawk.
What I'd like you to say, Jean,
Yes.
is that what you said in reference to Bruno about the loving shepherdess.
Oh, the loving shepherdess. Well, simply that without his tutelage, I never could have done it, that's for sure. It took 6 years. We mistakenly thought it might be we being Merle Armitage, and I don't think Jeffers cared one way or another. But anyway, Ward Ritchie, you know, was the printer. Great California printer. I'd like to point that out. That Grabhorn, who was more eclectic, a great printer, but he drew on the older styles. But Ritchie was the great modern printer who started off his whole career in Paris with a Jeffers poem. I think it was the Beaks of Eagles. I don't remember, but something. Anyway, he did a big sort of a folio, you know, as a start. So he was predisposed toward Jeffers' poetry from the beginning. But he was what you call a modern printer. He's still living, by the way.
Oh, really?
So, so Ward, we agreed, Armitage and I. It was I that wanted to do it, of course. It stirred up all this problem. And Merle, you know, he was kind of diffident. He liked my etchings, and he thought, well, someday I'll put one of Jean's etchings in one of my books. He said that, you know. But he kept coming to see me because he was a very close friend of Edward Weston. And this is again where people help in your life. It was Edward that introduced me to Merle. So Merle came to my studio, you know, the one in the Highlands, first one. He said, well, someday I'd like to see one of your etchings in one of my books. Then he kind of liked my mother, so he called on my mother, Merle did, you know, and then he came down again to my new studio. Here were a whole lot of new etchings. And so I thought, now's the time. I've got to ask or I'll never get it. So I had wanted, I don't know where I got the nerve, to illustrate a Jeffers poem. Wow, a long poem, not Roan Stallion, you can imagine, or Jabbar. I chose a lyric poem, the only one of the long ones that's lyric, which is called The Loving Shepherdess. And it's just a story that's taken from a Scottish poem, a note in one of Walter Scott's novels. So I'm talking about about Merle coming down again to the new studio in the Highlands, and I said, oh, he said, I'd like to put one of your etchings in one of my books. And I said, Merle, I stood up real straight. I said, how would you like to have me illustrate a whole poem and you publish it? Wow. Jeffers. Oh, he said. I see. He said, well, and this is Armitage, you know, he's that kind of person, and I'm paying a great tribute to that man because, first of all, he was an impresario in New York. Like Hurok, he brought all these great artists to America. I mean, he was friends of everybody, Shaliop and all of them. And he was used to doing things on a big scale and doing them fast. So he didn't hang around and say, well, we'll think about it. He said, all right, I'll speak to Jeffers right away. That's what he said. Well, he went over and he spoke to Jeffers and said, Gene said, what do you want to illustrate? I said, well, there's one poem I would like to illustrate because I'm very familiar with the coast. I know every inch of this. The story of the shepherdess is a very simple tale which Jeffers got out of a footnote to one of Walter Scott's novels, and it talks about a shepherdess who was sort of half crazy or mad or something. She had a little band of sheep, and she wandered around Scotland with these sheep, and one by one the sheep died off. And finally there weren't any sheep left, and she died. Simple. So, in this case, Jeffers has her start somewhere down near the Big Sur, and she comes all the way up the coast, and where does she wind up? Over on the Salinas River in a camp of hobos, we used to call them, or tramps. And there she died. So, I began to work on this. I said, now, let's see, I never thought about the cost of such an undertaking, you know. This was going to be a big volume, an important thing, and there were to be at least 9 etchings in it, and so Merle never talked about cost. Nobody mentioned a word, not even Ward Ritchie. We just said, well, we'll do this. So I began. And time went on. In the meantime, Merle was in New York. He was the editor of Look magazine at the time. And you know, things went pretty rapidly over there, and they didn't fool around. And he and Ward began to get a little impatient, and he wrote letters and said, now you're sitting on a rock out there, and you don't realize the value of time. This was after about 2 years. So then I began to wake up and to get to work. And it was hard work because, frankly, between us, I was not up to this job. It was just something that I wanted to do. And had the nerve to try. And Jeffers being a family friend and all, and yes, Gene can do this, that's all right, I'll go for it, I'll write an introduction and so on. So, in the meantime, so we went along. So finally I realized that I'd have to do something pretty quickly or the whole thing was going to go. So, I finished it. The last print I did was the first plate. The first plate I never could do, but I did it last. I woke up at midnight. I don't know if this would interest anybody, but the plate was lying on the table in the studio, all waxed up, and the needle next to it. And the sweat poured down my face. I knew that if I didn't do that print, the whole thing was finished. So I got up in the middle of the night and like a sleepwalker, and I walked over there and I drew the thing. And it was all right. So then, in the meantime, I thought, well, who's going to print all these etchings? What kind of an edition are we going to have? And Merle had the idea that it would set a precedent in America, that we were going to have fine art books like that, the way the Vollard people had in France, you know. But he didn't realize the nature, none of us realized the nature of American commercial need, and that you can't have books that take 5 or 6 years to make and that sort of thing too. Well, yes, writers do that, but In this case, it wouldn't be a precedent for illustrated books, we'll say. So, that being the case, I went to New York to find a printer. And I found a rather elderly gentleman who had done the last of Winslow Homer's plates. And he was nice to me. I said, look, show me what you can do. Imagine, you know. And I stood there and I gave him something to print. What was it? Some kind of other kind of etching. And he had all these presses around, you know, and he made a beautiful print. Oh, I said, that's wonderful. Well, he said, I think I'd like to do this. And I said, well, that's fine. We'll start with the first plate and second plate, and we're going to have a limited edition. 350, I think. And so, all right. So what happened was that Charles White probably got a heart attack, got sick, and didn't quite die, but almost did. So his wife wrote me a lovely letter, and she said, the game is up. Charles can't do this. And we've talked it over, and we think the best thing is for you to do it. Imagine that. For you to print the 2,000 prints that will be needed for this edition. And we'll send you the blankets for the press, the ink, everything. The paper you've already sent to France for. You've got the paper. And we'll send you the tarlatan to wipe the plates with. And good luck. So, all of this came to the Carmel Highlands and got dumped into my studio. And there I was, with 2 years of printing ahead of me. And I had a friend who, a woman who lived near us who was very good at arranging flowers. And I knew that she had a nice touch. And I needed someone to handle the wet paper because, you see, my hands would be all inky, you follow?
Yes.
And these pages had to be pristine because they were going into the books. So, my dear friend, and I've written about her in the book and all, she volunteered for something like $2 an hour, you know, something like that, to handle the paper and place it in the press and take it out of the press. All I had to do was wipe the plates, pull it through the press and so on. And I had to press because, and I'm not going to accept your, well, I'll tell you about that later, but anyway, I had the press that Armin Hansen had gotten for Doherty. And, don't laugh. And so it was a good press, and I printed them all on that press. So I said to Merle, look, we're in deep trouble. I have to print the whole thing myself. It's going to take 2 years. All right, he said, well, it will, he said, then let's just cut the edition in half. We'll have 150. That was pretty nice of him. So, we did. Now, to wind up this horrific tale, but it was quite a piece out of my life. In the meantime, who was going to pay for all of this? Nobody said a word about money all this time, you know. I could never have afforded it. And so, just then a patroness of mine in New York decided to send me some money. And she sent it in 2 parts. And it just came in a letter in the mailbox on the highway, you know, nothing fancy. So I knew I could pay the printer. But where Ward came in, where Merle Armitage came in, that was another story. He was used to dealing in many thousands of dollars with these great artists that he worked with. So I said to Merle, well, I said, I think I can pay Ward. Well, he said, I think I'll send you a bill for my services. Well, I said, okay. So he sent this tremendous bill, and he wrote paid in full at the bottom of it. So we had the book, and then he said, I think we ought to get Random House to put their name on it, not just ours. And he said, in return, I'll let them have 20 copies. And they did. Random, I mean. And so it went, all of it, and it's very hard to get a copy. Now they're worth about $1,500 a piece or more. But the point is, we sold it for what, 50? But I'm only saying this to point out that it takes, like, as in your group here, it takes a number of people to do, to bring off something that isn't, that has various technical aspects to it, or that has a wider artistic range. Anyway, to go back to Bruno, is his teaching. I won't say he taught me the technique, I taught myself that. But his teaching. And then you see Edward and Burl, and then Ward because he loved Jeffers, and Jeffers because my mother was a poet. All these things. And I was just a lucky one. So I spent a lot of time on that. He was, of course, never had etched in his whole life, but he was a friend of Mahan Rayong, some other etchers in the East. And he was a master draftsman, and his uncle had been a friend of William Turner. I think you have this already on some kind of tape. And Turner, who was known for his very messy watercolors, always said that the lines were in the artist's mind. They might not be on the paper, but they were up there in the mind. So Paul was addicted to good draftsmanship, and he used the pen a lot, which he probably taught me to use on a small scale, long before the etching thing came up. I could draw with pen and ink, because you see, you can't change anything, bingo, that's it. So Paul got the idea in his late years that he could etch, but it was too late. He didn't realize that the arthritis, to handle an etching needle, you have to have a very limber hand. And it requires tremendous control. So he asked Armin Hansen to get him a press. Paul did. And Armin got one in San Francisco. Instead of going to New York or Chicago or someplace, he found one in San Francisco. That's Armin, And it was some press. But it was not mechanized. Now that press out there at Murata that you're talking about, you have to be a real muscular man to handle a press like that. But my press had a steel roller, a big one. I mean, it was a big gauge roller. Well, it had an iron plate, a bed of the press was solid iron, and there was a roller below, and this big one on top. And you put blankets around the roller to shield the print from the pressure of this press. And it was turned by means of what's called a star wheel, which is a very pretty word, a name. And a star wheel is nothing more than a series of spokes that are anchored at the center to the core of the large steel wheel, a steel roller at the top. So the technique is simple. You have the bed of the press upon which you lay a blanket or whatever you want to put on it, and then the damp paper. The copper plate. In this case, of course, all the work was done on copper. Nowadays, they use other materials quite a lot for so-called etchings, but these were copper plates. After the plate was inked, and everything was so, then you laid the plate face up on the blankets, and you laid down the damp paper, which will be the page in your book, on top of the plate, and then more blankets, and so on. And then you take hold of your star wheel, and slowly you pass the plate under the roller, which exerts this enormous pressure and forces the ink down into the bitten lines. There's nothing esoteric about that. And so Paul was going to do all that but he found out he couldn't do anything. So he knew that he had taught me how to draw with ink. I mean, I knew how to draw all right. I'd been to Yale, oddly enough, in those years when no women were there. I was there for 3 years in the art school. And I learned how to draw because I had a great professor there. But, so he thought maybe Gene can etch. He wanted to kind of continue the idea some way, and since I was his only pupil, you know, and here was his press standing there not doing anything. So he said, well, what do you say? Would you be interested? Oh, I was overwhelmed, you know. I was so excited. And he said, but I said, I'm afraid. And this is where your story. He said, well, that's foolish. He said, let me tell you something that will take all that fear away. He said, have you ever been in the mountains? Well, of course I had, because Father was a mountaineer. Friend of Muir, you know, and Sierra Club, all of that. So. And I said, yes, I have. I've been in the high mountains. He said, then you've been over glaciated rock. And I said, yes, I have. You know, that wonderful, shiny, kind of gray-white rock, it just glistens in the sun. And he said, have you seen the scratches on the rock? And I said, yes. Well, he said, you know how they were made? I said, well, I hadn't thought about it. Well, he said they were made by the glacier carrying pebbles and stones under its surface and crossing over the rock, carrying things underneath the ice and passing over the rock and making these scratches. He said, do you see what I'm talking about? Just a natural event. Oh, I said, I think so. Fine, he said, go home and make a scratch. And you know, that took the whole fear out of me. And I went home and I bought, and then he said, I'll give you my tools from England that I collected. Imagine that. Beautiful dry points and all kinds of wonderful things. He said, those you can have, and you can pay a modest sum for the press. Very modest. And so I went home, and then the next thing that happened was that Cole Weston, Edward's son, you know, he had a dead hawk. I think it was a hawk, yes. He had a dead hawk in hand. And he knew I was interested at first. He says, I think I'll take that over to G. So Cole turned up with this dead hawk, and he put it right on the press. And the first thing I ever did was just dry point up a dead hawk, and turned out quite well. That's how it all started. That's what you wanted to hear.
Yeah.
Go home and make a scratch.
Now, can you talk a little? Oh, you want some water, Jean?
Now, what is it you want now?
Okay, the gift paper from George Seidman.
Oh, yes, gift paper. Yes. Well, George Seidnick, we were all in the Art Association. I resigned later for reasons I won't go into, because I was one of the founding members of the Carmel Art Association. But we were all members of that association, including both the Seidnicks, Catherine and George. George was Norwegian. He must have been, because the paper was Norwegian. And he knew that I was etching. And he was a kindly man who liked to do things for other artists. So I guess he thought, why don't I'm not going to use this paper. He had a store of paper which was made in Norway in 1848. And it was a royal Norwegian manufacture, and said so on the whole thing. And it was what's called wove paper. No, most paper that you buy to write on, I mean, well, we're not talking about commercial papers now, but if you lift a piece of paper up and look through it, you'll see lines in it. That's called laid paper, because the pulp is laid in a certain way to lead. But wove paper is so finely woven that you can't see anything in the way of texture. It's just like velvet, only thinner. And this particular paper was wove paper, and it was a pale Leonardo da Vinci green. So he gave me a stack of this paper, plus some other ones that were more unusual and different, but these, he said, were very precious. I don't know why he did it, but he did it. And so, the only time that Arvin Hansen ever came to call at my studio, and I don't know why or what the occasion was, he saw in the paper, lying there near the press, I had some of it out. He said, "What's that?" I said, "That's Royal Norwegian wove paper." And he picked up a sheet of it, and he looked through it toward the light to see the texture. And then Mr. Hansen turned to me and said, "Reserve all of this for dry point. Never use it for anything except dry point." And the reason he said that, and I did tell you this before, is that dry point etching has nothing to do with deep lines or acids. It's a dry point is a piece of steel. It's dry. It has a point on it, and you actually scratch on the copper plate the lines. But as you scratch these lines, it's like a farmer in the field plowing the dirt. It throws up a sort of a furrow. And on each side of this shallow line, which doesn't hold much ink unless you're very, that way, strong, it holds the ink in a sort of velvety way, a bit like Japanese sumi painting. Mm-hmm. It's the only thing in the whole art of etching that approaches Japanese ink painting. Anyway, so the point is that if you have a rough paper, if you use the paper that Seidnick gave me and that Hansen recommended, then nothing interferes with this smudge of ink on the sides of the lines. You follow? Mm-hmm. And the little that's left in the line really doesn't matter. It's this lovely sort of shadowy business. And you can control that by the size of the point that you use to cut the plate. If you use a diamond point, then it's extremely fine. If you use a heavy steel, then you get more furrow. So anyway, I did what he said, and I made most of my successful dry points on Seidnick's paper. But the kindness of people is, I have found all through this wonderful radiation of kindness that comes, and well, anyway, that's the point about Seidnick's paper. Now, he died, his wife died, and after that, of course, the paper lasted. It had been there since 1848. I still have some of this paper. Mm-hmm. Yes, I do.
I was wondering, the camera was off when we were talking about Robertson Jeffers, and I thought if you could talk a little about Robertson Jeffers, because we understand that in some writings he was considered cold and aloof and shy. And we were wondering if you could share some of your recollections of him.
Yes, well, I think that, you see, well, as Frederick Mortimer Clapp wisely said, he was the director of the Frick Museum, and he was a poet in his own right, a great friend of Jeffers. And when Jeffers died, he didn't like the idea of this Robertson Jeffers newsletter too much because he thought you should just read the poetry, Well, which leads me to say that an infinitude of critical essays have been written on the subject of Jeffers' poetry since, and many newsletters, and many interesting things have appeared in the newsletter, correspondence between Mrs. Jeffers and Mabel Dodge Luhan, and all kinds of things about this, their life with their sons, and all of that has come in, as well as these critics. But there has been, as you say, there's been a sort of the French call it a penchant, sort of an idea that he was an inhuman, that his sympathies were outside the human, that they were inhuman, not humanistic at all, and that nature and the universal workings of things, and that the human thing had its place in that, but he pushed this. In other words, people seized on this as saying that he was cold, and obviously he was shy. I had an experience with him that taught me why he was shy, and I went to call on him once, and he was working chopping wood. He also helped to build the stone tower, you know, himself, but he was chopping wood out there at the wood pile, and he knew me very well because my mother was an intimate, you know, I told you about the poetry connection, the family and all that. Well, and he came out from the wood pile. He knew someone was standing there, myself. And of course he knew me very well. But he didn't recognize me. The eyes, I think also he had a cataract in one eye, but his sight was totally inward, if you know what I mean. It took him several seconds or more, half a minute, to swivel around and focus outwardly. Oh, gee, you know. And right then I knew he had been involved in some kind of interior work. And people would have called that rude or shy or something. But so he said, oh, come and sit down, you know. And there was a little bench in front of Tor House. He said, come in. I said, no, I don't want to come in. We'll sit here on the little bench outside. And so we sat down, and I had brought him, oddly enough, a dry point of the head of that hawk that Cole brought me. And I was going to make a gift of this thing. I was bold enough, you know, and I knew he's crazy about hawks, so why not? And so he accepted it in a very nice way, and I said that it was just something that I wanted to make him a little present of, you know. I was kind of anxious to get away because I didn't want to interrupt him too much. So we got up and walked over to the car, and he asked about my mother. And I left. I never forgot that. He turned around, went back to the woodpile. But right then I knew that what some people would have called coldness. Later he wrote me a letter about the print, you see, you know, after a while. Now, about his philosophy I will not discourse. That has been overdone in the Jeffers newsletter. But I can tell you one other thing that will give you an insight, aside from the warmth of his home and hospitality all those years and his kindness to me. I will give you a little something that he said out loud to me also in the yard, which gives perhaps this other dimension to his nature. That's maybe, I have written about the other thing, about the woodpile, you know, that was printed in the Robinson Jeffers newsletter, I regret to say, but anyway, but this I never said much about, but I don't know what it was. We were standing there in the yard, as usual, and it was about something that was unpleasant. Whether it was a bird that had been killed, or was something that had happened, or it was a grievous thing. And I wasn't expecting him to make any comment of any particular importance.
And he said that you both had a special connection to Robinson Jeffers.
That is correct. He did, especially very deep, yes. Yes, there was a little group in those days. I wasn't part of that group. I was sort of on the periphery, but
he tells a story about how he went to Robinson Jeffers and asked if he could help him when he was building the tower. Wasn't that what he was building? and he declined. You know.
He said Jeffers was very kind, but he refused me.
That's
And
right.
he said I had the
Isn't
feeling that
terrific.
that-
Here's this great stone carver, you know, showing up wanting to help. Oh, that's marvelous, isn't it?
and he said he felt it was Gordon who felt that Jeffers' physical work of building the house and lifting those stones.
It was essential to his whole
it was like the
integration
gestation
and
period.
well-being at that time. That is true.
It was like the gestation period for his poetry.
Yeah,
he
just
needed
like
that
the woodpile,
solitude.
it took him 3 minutes to know who I was, you know?
Mhm.
Isn't that wonderful?
Mhm.
And it's just this rhythm of chopping the wood, and the whole world was somewhere else.
Yeah.
Yeah, boy,
pretty
that's
wonderful.
really something. So when you think I actually printed all these things,
You did
every single page, but without my friend, I could never have done it. I could never do it again. I mean, there's some things you can only do once in your life, and you can never do them again. It's out of the question.
That's true.